Let's talk shapes, shall we? But different kinds of shapes, a different way of talking about shapes, a different way of conceptualizing shapes, as a way of kind of like distancing yourself from what it is that you're drawing, and as a result, objectifying emotionally what it is that you're drawing, so that you have the capacity of looking at things in a little bit more of an emotionally distanced way, and as a result of that, drawing things potentially a little bit more accurately. Oh no! Oh, disaster. I just busted a bunch of shit over there. Okay. So what I mean by shapes, right? First off, I mean, there's the shapes that we've been going over so far, right? In terms of like your basic geometric stuff, right? Is like what does an arm look like as it's reduced to like a cone or a cylinder, right, etc. Right? What is this, potato sacky, right? Flour bag, right? Squash and stretchy type of thing, right? Those are different kinds of shapes. The simplification of a pelvis or a head, right, or a torso, right, into something that's relatively circular or squarish, right, or something along those lines. So that's one way of conceptualizing using shapes to make things a little bit simpler, even though it requires an ability to abstract from things. Another way of utilizing shapes, though, right, is to think of, two main categories of shapes or space, right, being, right, positive space. I'll just do that from this on, or from now on, right, and negative space. Now, the value of thinking about things in terms of space and shapes is that your brain has an emotional disposition towards what things look like, and that increases depending on your familiarity with it, right? So, for instance, like your brain has an idea of what a face looks like, or a hand looks like, or an arm looks like. And because we've been exposed to this stuff for so long, and especially since we've been starting, since children, like we've essentially tried to articulate those things for such a long period of time, and have come up with essentially shortcuts or habits that reflect, ways that make sense to us at varying stages of our life to try to communicate that information to people. These things can be more or less accurate, right? So, standard child's drawing, for instance, is, right, we get a big thing here, surrounded by some squiggly stuff. We get this shit that stands in basically for the entire body. And then we get these giant hands, right, and giant feet that are basically just basic shapes that bound this thing and separate it from its surrounding space. Even though the largest part of the body here, because we've got no real relationship to it, becomes like a really simplified shape. And circles and triangles, right? Well, basically circles is the earliest shape that we made. And then gradually expanding into triangles and squares, right, and shit like that as a way to represent these things. Now, these obviously don't reflect what it is that we're looking at, and they're obviously like a simplified and extreme version of this, but your brain does something similar, right, as it tries to grapple with the complexity of the body, right, and how to most accurately represent it. Is that your brain's actively trying to get you to draw shit like this, basically, is what I'm saying. And when you start to objectify shapes, right, you start to distance yourself emotionally from your brain's very intuitive desire in order to do this, and start to gradually focus on things the way that they actually appear, as opposed to the way that you think that things appear, right? Because your brain doesn't have a predisposition towards shapes or space, right? And as a result, it's likely to draw those things more accurately. So, as one way of describing, say, positive and negative space, let's say that you have a donut, and a donut being defined by the hole, right? The hole inside that donut is negative space. The donut itself is positive space. Now, depending on my attitude towards donuts, so to speak, right, I might draw that donut different. If I really like donuts, I might draw a donut like this, right? Because I guess I get less nut and more dough, so to speak. If I'm on some sort of weird fucking diet, that's for some reason exclude donuts, crazy talk, right? I might draw a donut like this. Lots more negative space, way less positive space. Point being is that your brain is going to start to change these things. Now, one way of drawing this thing more accurately is to think about this hole as just a shape and drawing just that hole. Another way of now defining the positive space around this hole is by taking vertical plumb lines from, say, the apex of the curve on any one side and forcing other chunks of negative space in and around that thing. Right? So if I gradually start to break this thing down in terms of other shapes, okay, well, I can now draw this chunk of positive space here, for example, and be less likely to make that thing or to exaggerate that thing in any one particular way, because I don't care what this shape looks like. I'm just trying to draw that shape. Likewise, I don't care what this shape looks like. So as I try and draw that shape, I'm much more likely to draw it more accurately. And as I basically stitch all of these things together, these chunks of positive and negative space, what I'm effectively doing is creating the drawing or creating the object, but creating it by default by drawing it in a different way. Right, so this will allow you to draw things more accurately simply because you don't care what this thing looks like. Now, this is obviously only so sexy as you start to talk about donuts, regardless of your attitude towards them. But let's say that I have, a standard pose where, it's hip on or it's hand on hip time again. Right? Well, one of the problems with drawing something like this is that you have an emotional predisposition towards what an arm looks like, right? Whether or not you're familiar with its anatomy in terms of like deltoid, tricep, bicep, right? Extensors, flexors, right, etc. To say nothing about the nightmare that drawing hands is for the vast majority of people, right? And then how that all interrelates with your lats, your rib cage, your pectoral, your obliques, right, the top of your pelvic girdle, etc. So one way of drawing this accurately is being a good observational drawer, as well as having some sort of anatomical and structural knowledge behind it. Another way of drawing this is by being a good observational drawer and just recognizing the relationship between different points of reference. So one point of reference, right, in a really big way could be this elbow. Another way, right, is this shoulder, right, and that wrist. So if I accurately identify, say, where this shoulder and this wrist are in relationship to each other, say along an angle, well, then I can correct that angle between those two basic shapes and now establish a rough idea of what this area of positive space looks like. Now, by simplifying this area of positive space into something like this, I can then control the angle between this point and this point. So between elbow and wrist, as a way of starting to identify that chunk of space. So one reason that we're using these shapes is it allows you to distance yourself from what, say, an arm looks like or a leg looks like, etc. Another way to use this shape is just by trying, or use shapes, is just by now trying to use this space here as a way of controlling all of the other stuff inside of it. So if I've got a rough idea of where that upper arm is and where it intersects with the torso, if I can draw this shape inside here and say use points of reference like the intersection point between the bicep and the forearm and the curve between the lat and the obliques. If I can compare those things accurately, the same way that I've compared, say, this angle and this angle in relationship to each other accurately, and then do that again and again and again between all of these individual smaller angles, what I'm effectively doing is drawing a portion of an arm, a portion of a hip, a portion of a torso, and drawing all that stuff without ever thinking about drawing an arm, a torso, a hip, a hand, right, etc. All I'm trying to do is draw this shape. And the more accurate I am by drawing that shape, the more accurate the corresponding form that traps all of those points of reference, shoulder, elbow, wrist, hand, right, into position. right? Because now those things have to be in that position because this shape effectively forces them into that position. Okay, so obviously it's a long way from donuts, right, to the human body, right? But this is one way of making things a little bit easier to draw. So for instance, a really common one that is always kind of overlooked that makes it really easy, or it makes a job significantly easier, is when you have this awful piece of business of the arm kind of like tucked up behind the head like this, right? And you're trying to figure out how to draw not only an arm in a really complicated position, but also how to draw the head, which is complicated irrespective of its position. Well, one way of starting to control that would be to see if there's any sort of gaps of space in between that arm and say the ear, and then the arm and the neck, so that if you knew that there were those chunks of space that had to exist inside that area, well, now at the very least, the arm and the head have to relate to each other like that. Right, so in a less extreme example, that's even more common, right? You might have something set up like this with the arm and the head. Just trying to draw this space in here, even in a rough capacity, is going to help you position those two things in relationship to each other. This is also a really useful way of controlling foreshortening. So let's say that you've got a pose that's lying down on the ground. I've done a version of this beforehand in previous examples, where the arms are kind of crossed in front of the body. If you can draw this chunk of space here and this chunk of space here accurately, what that effectively does is it forces the head, the torso, the forearm, the hands, right, all into that position so that they can't be anywhere else. So another really common version of that in a reclining pose. Say that we get something like this where somebody's leaning backwards, the legs, one leg's kind of out like this and the other leg's foreshortened, right, coming towards you. A really common way of screwing this drawing up is by pushing this leg way out here like this, where in reality, if I looked at, say, the underside of this foot that's tucked underneath and the distance between, say, the bottom of this heel and the bottom of that foot, if the bottom of that heel only had that much negative space in between it and the bottom of that foot, that means that this leg and that foot would now have to be connected back like that. So just by controlling that chunk of space there is a really useful way of taking care of problems like that. Okay, so this is one way of thinking about, right, space, right, and then using it as a way of controlling the pose and drawing it more accurately. What we're going to do with shade and shadow is, right, break down this positive space, right, into different highlight and shadow shapes afterwards. But before that, in the meantime and in between time, Mr. Loxley, would you mind taking a 5-minute pose for us? And something with a chunk of negative space and some foreshortening in it would be lovely. You're watching a fucking football game, dude. Where are you? Did we lose Loxley? See, I think he just thought I was going to be droning on for longer than I actually was and picked an inopportune time to disappear.
That's right, I'm back. Here. Okay, what do you want? Sorry?
Thank God. Thank God you're back. A 5-minute pose with some foreshortening involved in it, as well as some chunks of negative space.
Okay, gotcha.
Would be wunderbar. It would help to have your camera on for this as well.
Oh. I'm confused.
I was giving you like a moment's grace too. It's like, no, he's probably just like fucking around with some stuff. He'll get to it. Like, no, he's not. Maybe like a seated pose with like
Oh, seated
legs kind
pose.
of like tucked, maybe like legs tucked underneath you, and right, some chunks of negative space in there. Yeah, like on the ground seated. Because they relate more closely to my examples, which you weren't paying attention to, because you're watching the fucking football game.
I'm watching rugby. Japan Island.
Didn't know you were into rugby.
Yeah, I love it. Is that good?
Yeah, no, that's great. Okay, what do I want? Large. I don't want anything large. Okay, so importantly, this does not affect your gesture or your basic structure a whole hell of a lot. So your gesture and stuff, and this is, again, just as important as anything else that we're going to be adding to this equation, doesn't change. And the reason that it doesn't change is that essentially what the gesture does is it gives you something to correct. I mean, so we need that thing to correct as a way of making those corrections easier. Now, there are other ways of approaching this, but they're not really part of this class. Okay, so for instance, if I was to get into now structuring the pose, easiest way of, again, doing this is to do this with the easiest stuff first, not surprisingly. Right, so now structuring, say, that general proportion of the torso. So I've got a rough idea of where it is. Right? And as a result, giving me more particular stuff to correct. Right? And most specifically, say that I now start to put in this foreshortened arm. One way of controlling that is like, all right, it's easier to do that now because I've got this torso to connect it back to. But when I start drawing this, rather than trying to deal with this nightmare of a foreshortened arm, I can literally just draw this chunk of space right here. And the more accurate you are with it, I'm not pretending that this is accurate, but it's relatively accurate. The more accurate that space is, the easier it is now to draw this stuff, because now based on this, my wrist has to be right around here. And whether or not that's accurate or not, you can see how much more accurate it is than where my initial gesture was. So now anything that I try and do with the hand is going to be much more likely to be accurate, simply because the space that I've predefined for this allows it to be more accurate. And this in turn will then allow me to place the knee more accurately and then draw this unforeshortened foot and lower leg more accurately. Right? And then now again, you can see is like how much difference there is between the initial gesture and what it is that I've just drawn. And the more stuff that you start to develop, the easier things get to develop in the future. So one way of developing positive space, for example, is rather than thinking about the shorts as shorts, is that I can think about the shorts as now just a shape. And if I can draw that chunk of positive space accurately, what I'm going to get as a result is the legs and the pelvis that are then attached to that area. Likewise, underneath that, I can then draw this chunk of space, right? And that chunk of space has to start here because this is about where the foot disappears in behind the leg. And the top side of the leg then makes this overall shape with the underside of the upper leg, which now makes it a bit easier to try and figure out how to draw this leg, because that essentially forces, right, my upper leg and my lower leg into that relationship with each other. Likewise, I can use the surrounding environment to make the drawing a bit easier. Rather than thinking about this as an arm, you can think about where the arm starts, but now use that chunk of the bed, right, and the upper arm and the lower arm to block in just this shape here, which then effectively controls where the elbow has to be, where the wrist has to be, right, and then as a result, where the hand has to be. And at no point when I'm drawing this shape have I ever thought about drawing upper arm, lower arm, or hand. And I mean, you can do this with effectively any shape or any area of the pose. Negative or positive space, or negative space versus positive space, is just a really obvious way of doing it. I mean, simply because the holes in the body or surrounding the body are much more easily to discern with respect to the actual body itself. Thanks, Loxley. That was great. Loxley, that's great. Do you guys have any questions for me about what negative space is, how to use it, etc.? There's a lot more to it in terms of like how to draw that shape more accurately, but hopefully like the concept of using it makes sense. All good? Okay, the wave of silence is deafening. I like it. I take it as acquiescence for everybody understands. Let's talk shade and shadow, shall we? Mr. Loxley, no need for your camera feed just yet. Thank you, sir. Back to the football.
No problem.
All right, so shade and shadow. One way of thinking about shade and shadow, right, is obviously through value. Another way of thinking about it is through the shapes of those values. And it's useful to separate those things into two different categories. That way you can concentrate on the accuracy of the shape of the value that you're drawing rather than trying to get the value and the shape down accurately at the same time. So I'm going to break this up basically into two different parts, right? Where we'll talk about, the general characteristics and the shapes of those shades and shadows now, and then after the break, after lunch, we'll do a little bit more of a refinement and polish on that. Now, first off, there's two different kinds of shadows, right, or respectively called shades and shadows, depending on who you're talking to. Let's say that and the standard way of talking about this is by, talking about, a light source that's striking a sphere from a particular direction, and then as a result, there's going to be a portion of that sphere that's closer to that light source than other sections of it, creating the brightest highlight, and then that highlight gradually gradates off into successively less bright highlights until that value can't wrap around the three-dimensional surface of that particular object. So the shadow that's physically on the object as that light can't penetrate to the other side of it is called an attached shadow, attached to the actual object. And now attached shadow can also, again, depending on who you're talking to, can also be referred to as a shade. This is a way of distinguishing it from this shadow that's blocking out, or that is created by this object blocking out the light source and falling on whatever surface it happens to be falling on. This is referred to as a cast shadow. So whether or not you're referring to these things as attached shadows or cast shadows or shades and shadows doesn't really make any difference. What's important about them is that they have distinctly different characteristics to them. So it's nice to know that they are separate things. Now, the most important thing about either of those things, cast shadow or attached shadow, is that they both have shapes to them. So once that light source can't wrap around the surface of this object anymore, it's going to create this area where, just like your highlight is gradating into various or varyingly different intensities of highlight, you're going to reach this boundary point that effectively, right, blocks out, or that has that object effectively block out this light source from itself as it tries to wrap around that surface. So what I'm trying to do when I put in this attached shadow is essentially draw this shape of that attached shadow as accurately as possible. So I identify what the overall shape of that thing looks like. Likewise, I'm trying to do the exact same thing with a cast shadow. And then essentially what I'm doing after the fact is filling that space in. But what I'm doing is filling that space in with a particular directional line. And so what I mean by that is if the attached shadow and this line that's indicating its overall shape is running generally in this direction, what I'm trying to do with the value that I'm filling that space in with is pull that line up over top of it in the opposite direction. Reason being is that one way of creating space, or one way to creating volume to a particular thing is by, well, there's a number of ways of creating volume to a particular thing. Like I can create volume really simply just by determining that this space is separate from that space, right, and identifying that shape. I can also create volume by creating value inside that space. Right, so I start to separate light areas from dark areas. But what I can also do in terms of creating value or volume is say, irrespective of whether or not I have value attached to it, I can have a line going in this direction describing a plane and another line going in this direction describing another plane. Whenever those planes change, you get a sense or a description of volume or the implication of volume. Well, a sphere has a potentially infinite array of planes. And two of those planes, one of which is going in this direction, the other ones are going in this general direction. So when you get the opposition of those two lines meeting with each other at effectively right angles, what you get is one plane telling you that there's a certain surface and then another plane telling you that there's a different kind of surface. And as a result, we start to inflect the idea of volume. Now, this is distinct then as from, say, doing something like this, where I can describe this overall line that identifies this shape, but then start to fill things in like this. What this does is tends to flatten things out because all of those planes are now going in the same direction as opposed to going in opposing directions. Likewise, right, what will tend to flatten things out into two-dimensional shapes, one light and one dark, is by treating this line and this interior value that you're filling that shape in with in a certain way. What we want to try and do is first off, make that line just a little bit darker than this interior value. And then also with respect to the attached shadow, pull that line up over top of that edge. Because that shape, or rather attached shadows, are going to have a particular kind of characteristic. That particular characteristic is that this line isn't so much of a line as it is an indication of where things gradually move from light into dark. And along that transition from highlight into gray, into dark, and then back into gray, right, you have this line, which is alternatively known as either your transition line, right, because it identifies where things are transitioning from light to dark, or alternatively your core line. Core line being referring to the core of the shadow, which means that that line is going to be the darkest area of your attached shadow. So one way of starting to inflect light again or inflect volume again is to make sure that this line, right, or the implication of a line, is slightly darker than the interior value that you put inside of it. Because what you'll get otherwise is if I put in this line like this, and even if I shade up to that and then over the top of it, if those values are exactly the same, I lose a sense of depth to that object because now I've basically flattened this out into a homogeneous value, just like this is a homogeneous value. So rather than getting a sense of depth that you can kind of start seeing developing here, I get two flat two-dimensional spaces of different value. The same thing is going to be true with a cast shadow, is that my cast shadow is going to be moving in this general direction. So that interior value, I want to pull up to the edge of that. But unlike the attached shadow, I don't want to go over top of the edge of it. Because where this has like kind of a soft fuzzy edge, your cast shadow will have more of a hard, crisp edge attached to it. Right? Because the shape is going to be much more distinct as this light source, right, physically can't penetrate, right, to that particular point. Now, whenever we're dealing with value, we're not dealing with line. Right? There's more and more realistic that you want to become with your drawings, the less and less line value you actually have. Like I don't come with a line surrounding me, not Steve or any of you. Right? But line is a useful way of demarcating one area from another area, demarcating this shape from this shape from its surrounding space, so that as these two shapes fall into each other, I can accurately draw those shapes as much as possible in order to start to describe the surface that's underneath it. Now, This stuff doesn't affect your 30-second drawings or your 2-minute drawings, really. And really, to be fair, there's only so jazzed up you can get about talking about a ball. And there's only so much value we can get from it until we start to relate it to the form. Well, let's say that this is your 30-second arm and hand. Well, your 30-second arm and hand doesn't change. Neither does your 2-minute arm and hand change, right? So when I start layering in, right, anatomy, bicep, tricep, right, lat, your extensors and your flexors, right, etc. Once I start putting all this stuff in, this is just the structural aspect of the pose, which means that value doesn't need to be included inside this section because the value is not going to be responsible for how that underlying structure works. Value, however, is a really useful way of starting to try to help to identify what that structure is doing. Because the only reason that this shape here takes on this shape is because of the way that this light source reveals the overall structure or surface or contour of that particular thing. Now, again, it's only so sexy when you deal with a ball, but if we're dealing with an arm, and let's say that your light source is now coming from here. If I draw this transition line, right, or this edge line of a cast shadow here, as accurately as possible, what I'm indirectly doing is identifying, okay, well, how does the light fall over top of this deltoid? And then how does that deltoid maybe cast a shadow over top of the bicep? And then how does that bicep pick up a shadow and then move into the shadow that's created by this extensor? Right? And then how does that extensor change direction as it comes into the shape of the radius? And then how does that radius, right, and its interaction with the thumb and its tendons, how does that shadow change direction as it comes into the hand? So what I'm doing when I'm drawing that shadow, once I fill this overall area in a roughly perpendicular direction, is starting to identify where all of those muscles and tendons and bones have to be. Right? Because the only reason that they're moving is in a particular way is because of, right, or the only reason that that shadow shape is moving is because of what all those muscles, bones, structure underneath the surface are doing. And so that structure and that shadow reference, right, have a really nice symbiotic relationship with each other because you can basically draw anatomy perfectly and be entirely unaware of it if you're a really good observational drawing or a really good observational drawer and have really good reference. Because now all you need to do to accurately identify where that shadow stuff is or where that anatomy stuff is draw that shadow as accurately as possible. And likewise, that shadow, or sorry, that anatomical stuff that we've gone over, right, and will continue to go over, will help to identify, make it easier to draw shadow reference in the event of not having really good reference or lighting conditions. Okay, so those two things, right, the structural stuff, the anatomical stuff, right, as well as this observational stuff, right, and the technical nuts and bolts of it, have a symbiotic relationship with each other as we try to make your drawings a little bit more accurate. This also is a really convenient way of getting away from line value, right, where, you know, we're just going kind of as a default to just outlining the pose, right, each and every drawing. And because of that tendency to start to privilege line and exterior shape over top of value and color, which is quite natural thing to do. But it also makes it easier for us to draw certain areas, right? Because line might be the easiest way to describe a pose. Structure might be the easiest way to describe a pose, but value, right, might be the easiest way to describe a pose as well. In addition to that, it then takes this overall positive space and breaks it up into two different chunks of positive space, which makes those individual chunks of space a little bit easier to deal with. So, Mr. Loxley, could I use you as an example, pretty please? And let's see how your lighting conditions work with what I want to do. Okay, perfect. So would you be so kind as to just hold your arms up to the side, right, with their palms down? Yeah, perfectly. Okay, now, so what you see like along Steve's arms there, as the light's hitting the top of the arms, right, and then creating, right, this kind of directional shadow, right? That's very similar to what it is that I've drawn here. Now, Steve's going to slowly turn his palms up towards the ceiling, and watch how that shadow shape changes. Okay, so as he's changing the direction of his arm, right, in relationship to that light or that light source, that shadow shape starts to change, right? And then as he slowly turns his arms or his palms back down towards the floor, right, we can watch that shadow shape change again. Okay, so what we're trying to do when we draw these shapes is to try to draw that shape as accurately as possible. And then if you can just keep twisting your arms so that your palms face the back wall, if that's possible, right? Look at how radically that changes, right? And then gradually turn your palms back towards the floor again. So when we're talking shadow shapes, what we're looking for, thanks, Steve, that's great. I know it's hard to hold the arms up like that, is big shapes like that, right? So Steve, if you could just back up into that position again, that would be great. Thank you, sir. Okay, so really, no, not in that position, just like hanging out there. Yeah, exactly. So a really useful shadow shape, say in this pose, would be, say if I'm drawing that neck and head area. A really useful shadow shape, or really useful shadow shapes rather, would be what's happening underneath the eye sockets. Those really clearly defined eye shapes there. Likewise, underneath the nose, and then along the cheeks. And you see how that breaks up the face into two highlight pools on the upper lip, right? But then the rest of the lower face, right, is essentially on in shadow shapes. All of this stuff inside the neck is now cast shadow, and then the cast shadow that the face itself, or the head itself, is physically casting on the torso. Okay, so that's a really useful shadow, right? What isn't a useful shadow? Right? As I come down here along the inside of this, or along the inside of the pectoral, this right here, it's too light, right, to be of use for us inside a short period of time. We'd have to drop below the pectoral, right, into this harder, more identifiable shadow shape. That's a really useful shadow shape, right, because the shape is much more easy to determine, right? Which means that if we came over into this arm here, you've essentially got two different options with that arm. One would be to identify this is the start of the shadow shape there, and then the whole arm is basically plunged into one value. And then inside that area, right, you might have a darker value that would help to determine, right, that there's a greater degree of contour change there. The other option would be to draw the same structural arm, right, but now ignore everything that's in this kind of mid-tone area and draw just this shadow shape here. Right, because we don't have time inside 5 or let alone or 10 minutes or 15 minutes, let alone 5 minutes, to do a really detailed observational value drawing. Right, so if we came into the stomach, for instance, right, the only shadow shape that would be useful there, right, is this shape, right, that comes in underneath the stomach there. And you'd be ignoring all of the variants, right, of subtle shadow shapes up in here. These shapes directly underneath the rib cage, right, might be a little bit more useful as a way of determining, right, difference of abdomen from rib cage. Okay, so Mr. Loxley, could we do a 10-minute pose, please? And I'll do a demo, right, of this, and then you guys will do a bunch of 10-minute poses or some more 10
Anything in particular?
What's that?
Anything in particular, standing or?
Doesn't
sitting?
matter. No, it doesn't matter. Yeah, this is a decent page for you guys to screenshot as well in terms of the characteristics of shade, shadow, etc. Also, hold on just a second, Steve. I'm just going to go flip back to previous page here, and that's not a bad page for you guys to screenshot with respect to positive and negative space as well. Okay, so all these things are, right, at one stage is, at one level is tools for us to make our drawings a little bit more accurate, because it helps to make things a little bit easier to draw objectively. But especially with respect to shade and shadow, they become a really powerful aesthetic tool as well, because they give us a really useful way and a really interesting way of starting to not only stylistically represent stuff. All right, Loxley, whenever you're ready. They give us a really useful way of not only representing the pose more accurately, but also more realistically. Because again, right, we don't have lines around us. Right? But also give us a lot of latitude now in terms of decisions that we can make with respect to how it is you want to stylistically represent stuff. So in some instances, value is going to be the most appropriate way and the easiest way to start to identify things. Now, again, importantly, is like this doesn't change your structural stuff. All of your structural stuff is just as important as it ever has been, right, as it ever will be. Right, and you kind of want to think as value as a way of starting to, as another way of kind of like trying to understand structure, make structure a little bit easier to identify because the shadow shapes are so closely related to it. Right, but not something that you're trying to start with. Right, because when we start with that structural stuff, or sorry, when we start with that detailed shadow stuff, we will still have a tendency to focus on the details rather than the whole, and that gesture and that basic structure allow us to essentially establish a whole first, as opposed to, you know, individual elements of that whole. Whole with a W, Steve, rather than an H. Although the whole with a W, I suppose, does have an H as well, doesn't it? It's confusing the English language. Steve's watching rugby. He doesn't care what I'm saying. But I don't think it actually matters whether or not you're watching rugby to determine whether or not you care about what it is that I'm saying. I think that's effectively balanced in the equation. We all know where you stand, Steve. Okay, so all this structural stuff that I'm doing, right, is no different than anything else that we've done up until this point. And the only thing that's going to change with respect to this as we move forward, right, is that we're just going to add more and more structural stuff to this. Okay, so the shade and shadow shapes that we were going over with respect to developing the facial features last day, right? This becomes particularly useful now when we start to break down, you know, where those facial features are going to be, separating hair from face, etc. Okay, so now inside this space, I can start to look for shadow shapes. Starting to identify, all right, well, what's this shadow shape here inside the torso as it starts to drop over top of the rib cage? And this is why some anatomical information is useful. Because as that shadow shape drops over top of that pectoral and then moves in underneath this section here and changes shape as a result, I've got a really clear indicator and landmark as to where your rib cage and the bottom of those ribs start to move into your abdominal tract. And then also as I move into this section here, where that central abdominal tract, your rectus abdominis, it moves into a sheath that separates it from the obliques. And then as I come over top of this area here, how I move into the underside of the deltoid as it interacts with the pectoral, right? And then how that anterior deltoid moves around that junction point, the clavicle, and starts to create this overall shape on the upper arm. And so hopefully you can see is like what I'm doing here is really no different than what I was explaining with positive space, or sorry, with negative space, in the sense that I'm trying to draw this shape as accurately as possible. And just like I'm trying to draw this shape based loosely on the positions that I put those basic geometric shapes inside here as a way of describing that overall chunk of space. So when I describe this chunk of positive space, I've now effectively separated one extensor from another extensor. And as I come down underneath the arm here, I can start trying to grab this overall shadow shape as a way of separating highlight and shadow inside that positive space. And the rest of the body is effectively exactly the same. Now, there are decisions that you'll have to make, as I was mentioning. Like, so for instance, whether or not I want to try and grab this chunk of the abdominal tract here, right, or ignore it and combine it with this more aggressive shadow underneath the belly button. But in either case, hopefully what's coming across is that, I haven't drawn a single line yet, and there's lots of volume that's starting to develop with the pose. And in almost every instance, right, it's been a more effective way of drawing that area. Now, I can use line, for instance, in that blocking technique that we've gone over as a way of starting to demarcate where a more accurate idea of the exterior of this arm is. Right? But then rather than trying to draw that arm in terms of line value, simply because all of this is going to be a single value, I can basically just flood this whole section of the arm with that overall value. And I get something that looks a little bit better than just a bounded shape. Right? That doesn't require line in order to describe it. Now, you can use line, right? And this is what we'll go over in the second half of class in terms of identifying the more particular characteristics of. Like, I can now start to push the side of that pectoral and rib cage as a way of developing a separation between arm and hand. I can now start to push, right, this change of direction here in the armpit, right, and do a slightly more developed value study inside this area as a way of separating rib cage, lat, and bicep from each other. I can start to push the characteristics of my transition line in this area so that I get a more aggressive sense of value in there, right? But also a greater sense of volume inside that area as I get some reflective light in this section. I can exaggerate the harshness of this line here and this transition line there, as well as the reflective light that exists in between them as that deltoid moves into conjunction with the pectoral to describe not only an attached shadow moving into a cast shadow, but also volume inside that area. So this might be something that you're able to achieve inside like a 5-minute pose, right? It's just this really light description of light areas versus dark areas. And when we get into a 10 or a 15-minute pose, and then you start to push these characteristics, right? We start to get, slightly more, well, you've got more time to do a more developed version of that, and as a result, create more volume. So ultimately what we're doing is trying to mix and match line, but also use techniques that are the most appropriate and effective for describing the area that we're trying to deal with. Right. So rather than just kind of defaulting towards line, in these next series of drawings, what I'd like you to try and do is gesture and structure the same way as you have, but then block in these negative shapes, positive spaces of highlight and shadow shapes as a way of demarcating and breaking up that space a little bit more accurately, and then filling in those shadow shapes first before you start trying to identify line value anywhere. Right, so some areas are going to be left really gestural, some areas are going to be left somewhat structural, some areas are going to have a little bit of shadow area developed into it, right, and all to varying degrees. Thank you, Mr. Loxley. That's great. All right. So, any questions before we move forward? Great. Well, thus ends all the words that I need to say. Steve, let's do 2-minute or 2 10-minute poses, and then we might finish with like a 15 or a 20. Just as a way of accentuating what we were talking about with the shadow shapes, there's some key characteristics to these shadow shapes. First off, right, when we're breaking these things up into shapes, right, that's helping to identify the value of, or sorry, the shape of the value of things. And as I mentioned, as you fill in this space, what we're trying to do is pull this interior shade up perpendicularly to the general run of the direction of this line, that line being your transition line. But what I was also mentioning is that this, right, should be slightly darker than your interior shade. So what that means is basically what you're creating inside of here is a rough indication as to where a dark section starts to occur, but that dark section isn't a line. It's a rough indication of where lighter stuff on one side, as it starts to gradate into highlight, is moving into that dark stuff, and where that dark stuff is starting to move into lighter stuff on the other side. And that darkness, as it gradually moves from one direction to another, is the thing that's starting to create a sense of volume. And what that also creates is the other characteristic of the attached shadow, which is reflective light. Reflective light being this light source striking the underside or striking the surface of whatever this object is sitting on, and then bouncing back up and hitting the underside of it. And that would be distinct from, say, like a rim light, where this object would be physically blocking out a light source, and then that light would be shining around the periphery of that object. Now you can start, the nice thing about this is that not only it creates depth, but you can start to push this and accentuate it. So depending on what you're attracted to or what you're kind of trying to achieve in terms of the value of a particular thing or the drama of a particular thing, I can start to push the level of contrast of that area and make that transition line darker and darker and darker, and make the contrast level greater and greater and greater. And that reflective light, say, more and more noticeable. And now, whether or not you draw it like this or like this, so that that value is just, that change of value is barely noticeable, those characteristics still remain, right? So even though you might not be able to see it because the lighting conditions don't really allow it to be this apparent, you still want to try and darken this, because that's the thing that's giving that area volume. And you can also use surrounding areas, like, so for instance, this shadow shape, if I darken, like when I initially put this value in, I'm going to expose a little bit of that reflective light. But if I just arbitrarily push how dark that area is directly underneath the ball, you can start to see how that reflective light starts to become more and more exposed, and the effect more and more obvious and dramatic. Right? And again, that characteristic is still going to be there. But if I flatten it out so that those two values are homogeneous, I lose that sense of volume. And all I need to do is make that surrounding context just a little bit darker as a way of revealing that reflective light. Now you can also use negative space as a way of doing this. So I can artificially start to push contrast in one area of the drawing versus another by, say, darkening the area that's in and around that section of the object. And as a result, pushing the contrast of it. And then ultimately what this allows you to do is also push the focus of a particular picture. So when you're dealing with individual drawings, right, you can physically start to identify areas that are going to be more interesting to your audience, so that your audience, to whoever's looking at the picture, people who are looking at your portfolios, will physically start to pay more attention to the areas that have this greater degree of contrast, because it's essentially taking advantage of something that your brain does quite naturally on a deep-seated biological level, where it starts to pay attention to areas that have more detail, have more contrast, right? Because they're essentially hardwired this way on an evolutionary level. Okay, so Mr. Loxley, if I could get you to help us out with a demonstration of sorts. Do you have a white piece of paper there by any chance?
A white piece of paper?
Yeah, or anything white, reflective.
I think my shirt.
Shirt will do.
What do you want?
Well, first for you to turn your camera on.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, right. Then what?
Yeah. All right. What's the lighting condition there like? If you just hold your arm out to the side again. Yeah. Okay. That's good.
There?
Okay. So see how with Steve's arm right now, this is what Steve's arm looks like, right, in terms of its basic shape. Right. And then inside that basic shape, I'm starting to draw in this light representation of that transition line. Right. And then filling that space in with, you know, a rough idea of that overall value, right? And because this is a little bit darker than that, then I get that idea, or the idea. Now I can start to push that transition line just a little bit, so that, you know, that becomes a little bit softer, less liney, right? And a little bit more naturalistic. Now, Steve, if you could take your other hand and hold your shirt up underneath your arm, the arm that's raised.
Oh, put it under there?
Yeah, just hold it up like underneath, just a little bit underneath, further down. Okay, so now remove it. Take it away. Okay, look at how the reflective light changes. There, it's a lot less noticeable, and when Steve puts the shirt back, see how that becomes a lot more noticeable. So that's effectively what you're doing. Say Steve takes it away, right, and it might look like this. So you draw it with a little bit less contrast. Steve puts it back, right, and now all of a sudden that becomes a lot more noticeable, right, and you can push, right, that transition line as a way of making that a little bit more accurate in terms of contrast. Thanks, Steve, that was great. Right? But even if it doesn't look like this, you can still draw it like this, right? And this is what I mean by the expressive aspect of it, right? And the getting what you want out of the drawing rather than being limited by what the drawing is giving you. I can start to push that level of contrast to whatever degree it is that I want, because the characteristics are the same. It's just the stylistic representation is slightly different. And then likewise, I can essentially do the exact same thing with negative space on the other side. And I can use that value as a way of coming up to the edge of the line. You tit.
Sorry.
That's quite all right. It's obviously pretty exciting what's happening over there.
Oh, it's an unbelievable game. Oh,
I'm muting your dumb English ass.
sorry, man.
Right, so as I push, right, that level of contrast here, you see how it starts to that negative space starts to come up to the edge of the form, right, and become the line, as opposed to using line there. And I can do the exact same thing on the other side. Use negative space as a way of creating an edge line rather than using an actual line to create it. Both of those things are useful, and they're useful in different circumstances, but it's nice to be aware of this, right, depending on what it is that you're trying to do. Okay, any questions about these further characteristics of the things and stuff? All right, you guys want to see a demo of this, or is this suffice for a demo? You guys just want to draw? Either is good for me.
Demo would be nice.
Demo. All right, Mr. Loxley, let's do a 10. Pretty please. Oh, you guys can screenshot this. It's not a bad thing to just add in to the thing that you already have. Mr. Loxley, please take on a pose that faces away from the television.
Too hot.
Just to be a dick, take a pose that faces away from the television.
Hang on.
Leave the television where it is. No, I'm just kidding, dude. Leave it where it is. You can point whatever direction you want. Okay.
There's 9 minutes left.
Still 1-1.
Yeah. So it be extra time. Oh.
All right, well, that's perfect. Let's leave Loxley's mic on so that we can watch him fall apart while when Denmark scores in the next 9 minutes and before this demo ends. That'll be fun.
So anything you want in particular?
Doesn't matter.
10 minutes?
Yeah, please. Right. Just making things bigger here on my end. Okay. Is this the 2022 World Cup mascot that we're looking at here?
Hmm?
You're the 2022 World Cup mascot.
I don't know.
What do you mean you don't know? I just said that you are. It's a strange choice, granted. I do agree with that.
The old man and the ball.
As a surprise to everyone, Steve Loxley, little known North American life model, makes a surprising entrance as the new World Cup mascot. Equally surprising to everyone is the outrageous success of said mascot.
I could make a fortune. I could retire, finally.
You're good, retire. You're never going to retire, dude. You and I are going to be working until we die. Okay, so again, none of this stuff affects this gestural or structural stage. What happened? What happened, Loxley? Good things?
He just pulled him back, and it's like he should have been a yellow because he's pulled him back and he didn't give him a yellow.
Stupid.
I'm not over impressed with the referee, I've got to say. He's made some strange decisions.
Refs, hey, Loxley? Refs.
Right. So, nicely done.
Remember, if something exciting happens, you're a professional. I expect you to maintain your composure. Nobody's here for amateur hour, Oxford.
Ah,
What do you think you prefer watching? Soccer or snooker?
rugby.
Because to be fair, both are about equally exciting.
Different
Okay, so
levels.
once, hush now, Steve, hush. Okay, so now inside these areas, right, I can just essentially go in, right, and start blocking in the shadow shapes, right, and now deciding what area I want to physically concentrate on. And this is a useful, surprisingly useful thing to do for yourself, is that basically pick an area that you find interesting and that you want to spend time on. And then rather than trying to finish absolutely everything in the drawing, it's just starting to focus on that particular area. And the value of doing this is that it basically cuts out a lot of the options that are going to present themselves to you in favor of the thing that you find more interesting to draw. And as small of a thing as it sounds, drawing something that you find interesting to draw makes a significant difference in terms of your likelihood to want to spend time on it, get it done right, as well as, you know, just your overall level of enthusiasm for a particular area,
Okay, good.
for the drawing. Okay, so now that I've got that kind of blocked in, I can essentially now start to push the values inside that area. And this is where having a larger representation of what it is that you're drawing will make a bigger difference, because you're physically not going to be able to see a lot of the detail otherwise. And this will also be a reason why we start to deepen the anatomical knowledge that we have of different areas of the body as well, right? Because the references so small or not ideal in a lot of ways, or in a lot of instances, it's difficult to actually figure out what's happening in certain areas. And that can be mitigated by anatomical knowledge, because certain things have to interact with other areas in certain ways. And I would suggest as well, when you're doing this, is to start off relatively light when you're putting your values in. Reason being is that it's very easy to go darker. Like I can start to push this really, really easily as a way of making that more aggressive, but it's much more difficult to make that light. Also, you'll discover as you get deeper into the experience is that you don't actually read or need all that much contrast and all that many dark lines in order to accentuate and pronounce a lot of the midtones that you're going to be developing. It's the midtones, right? These lighter values that end up doing most of the legwork in a drawing. But it's the dark stuff that kind of gets all the glory, or the contrasty areas that kind of get all the glory, because they're the things that they're the bits that make the drawing look sexy. right? But without those midtones, without that midtone stuff, yeah, it'd be pretty boring. Don't know what I did there. Okay, so rather than kind of like racing off and just drawing whatever, you know, I'm basically sticking in and around this particular area here. And each new area that I'm developing, I'm effectively just going through the same process again. So if I don't have enough information kind of blocked out, either in terms of accurate shadow shapes or accurate structural shapes, before I start committing to anything that resembles a detail, line or value or otherwise, I'm essentially just going back through that same process and making sure that, you know, I've got something that's reasonably sound on before I start doing something that would be very difficult to, you know, fix, so to speak. And also, it's like you'll recognize this, like as you start doing a value study, right, or start piecing these values together and start changing some of the values by darkening them a little bit. And some of the other values will be a lot more appropriate to their area now. So for instance, as I darken this area here a little bit, that makes this area a little bit better. As I darken this area here a little bit, right, that does the exact same thing. Right? And if this is all that you get done inside 10 minutes, right, then that's a lot. And that's great. That's just what you get done. Right? As opposed to trying to get everything done, right, all at once. So let's, for shits and giggles, Steve, let's do a 15-minute pose. Oh, what happened? What happened? Oh, missed a glorious chance, did they?
4 minutes left of 6 minutes of injury time.
Oh my God. I like watching sports that I don't care about. It's a lot of fun to see people get really excited about them. All right, let's do a 15-minute pose, Steve, and then we'll finish with a 20-minute pose. How's that sound?
Sounds good. So, time.
Right, everybody, shares and feeds up, and business as usual, but when you get into the detail phase of things, pick an area that you find interesting in terms of value and try to detail that area first before doing anything else.
Are we doing 10 right now or 15?
No, we're doing a 15-minute pose and then we're doing a 20-minute pose.
Okay.